Good afternoon. Welcome to DEI and Wellbeing, Making the Right Choice. I'm Ted Pizzo from Lockton. It's great to see you all, or listen to you all. So let me try to pull this together in a concise way that hopefully makes sense. First, Lockton, as some of you may know, we, Lockton, provide several thousand clients around the world with employee benefit consulting, risk management, and insurance brokerage services. I also coordinate an organization called the Northeast Executive Advisory Group, which started in 2004. NEAG includes thousands of community leaders, business executives, and professionals. Over the years, we've helped each other with everything from providing ideas and intros that make our respective organizations better, to collaborating on various charitable endeavors and assisting those between jobs land in the right place. And by the way, NEAG has extended over the last decade way beyond the Northeast. So in 2020, we launched an NEAG subgroup, thanks in a big way to Yvette Alston and Tom Bailey, who you'll meet in a moment. That subgroup we call NEAG DISC. DISC is our acronym for diversity, inclusion, and social collaboration. The mission of DISC has been to align our business objectives, social responsibilities, and personal priorities, which brings us to today's Healthcare Innovations Group session. HIG has quarterly meetings, and we focus on sharing ideas that really enhance the delivery of high quality, cost-effective healthcare. These ideologies of these three distinct groups meld together today nicely to offer what I think is really a meaningful and timely platform. So today's platform purposely revolves around infusing as much of our collective experience as possible. Thus, we have some questions we're going to go through. Following today's session, you can reach out to me. I may reach out to you about what we're doing at Lockton, or to get involved in NEAG, or the DISC subgroup, or connect with Carole at Dario, or Yvonne or Tom at Indelible Impressions Consulting. I want to say this convergence of ideas today is really the brainchild of Carole Noujaim, who you'll meet in a moment. Carole is the VP of Employer Sales for North America at Dario. She's also the chair of Dario's DEI committee, and she's a brilliant consultant and a genuine friend. So let me hand it off to Carole.
Thank you, Ted. I should have you introduce me in all of our sessions. That was awesome. So as Ted mentioned, I'm Carole Noujaim. I'm the VP of Employer Sales for North America at Dario Health. I'm also the chair of the Dario DEI committee, which I'm extremely passionate about. As many of you, I think, know, Dario is a global polychronic solution leader that is really helping revolutionize the way people live better lives. By addressing behavior through a combination of connected devices, human coaching, and this hyper-personalized AI that adapts life to prompt, anticipate the needs of each individual user while helping them manage their chronic conditions, specifically managing and improving their metabolic, musculoskeletal, and behavioral health in a really integrated and whole health way. As part of that approach to reach everyone and their needs, we recognize the key components of diversity, health equity, and inclusion to meet every member where they are, and allow them to not have as a heavy lift as they've had to have in the past in order to manage their conditions. We, in essence, use insights and trends from our learnings or from the learnings of one condition to inform another. Today, we are talking specifically about DEI and how the elements of DEI are key drivers for employers in facets like acquisition, engagement, retention, productivity, well-being, morale, and so on. As you know, this all relates to culture and how DEI has become a critical component of culture as opposed to just a silo that needs to be addressed. It's no longer enough to have well-being solutions be built for someone like an individual. Moving forward, people are requiring support that is relevant for each individual so that everyone feels included with an experience personally curated for them. And most importantly, that changes as they change. The only way to achieve that is to address diversity dimensions as part of that engagement in order to achieve sustained and thoughtful engagement that leads to outcomes. And that is what we will be discussing with our expert panel today. Ted?
Thanks, Carol. So our expert panel will discuss the state of DEI today, from what it looks like in our own day, sort of our day-to-day work, I should say, to the most pressing challenges we're looking at to address with DEI initiatives. How initiatives can be effectively woven into your well-being strategy and how we can measure success. We all bring an inquisitive mindset to the table, or literally, I guess, the screen today, i.e. we evolve, we may be thinking, is this the right time for Y at my company? What about X at our organization? We've tried Z and ran into some headwinds. So let me start by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves and their roles. I'll start with Yvonne.
So much, Ted and Carol, for hosting this really relevant and important discussion today. Good afternoon to everyone attending. My name is Yvette Alston. I'm the culture architect, CEO, and founder of Indelible Impressions Consulting. We are a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging strategy firm located right in Newington, Connecticut. My passion and purpose in DEIB really centers on dismantling barriers in thinking and feeling on what makes us different so that we can all learn and grow from one another. And Indelible really wants to help people understand the importance of culture and its impact on the human experience in work and community settings. So with that, thank you, and I'm honored to be here.
Okay, and I'm Omar Maneshwala. I'm a psychiatrist. I'm the chief medical officer of Dario Health. Dario Health makes the right thing to do, the easy thing to do. I'm responsible for all things clinical here. And prior to joining Dario, I joined a small company about 10 years ago. We grew that to about a $500 million market cap. And that company was responsible for developing behavioral health solutions for health plans in the ASO market. So Dario Health really exists for one reason, which is, as I mentioned, to make the right thing to do, the easy thing to do. So we apply dynamic personalization, behavioral science, and consumer experience and consumer DNA to deploy hyper-personalized member journeys that help people improve their chronic conditions and reduce the total cost of care. Today, we do that for diabetes. We do it for prediabetes and obesity, high blood pressure, behavioral health conditions, and musculoskeletal conditions on a single integrated platform. So it's a pleasure to be with you all today, talking about something that's critically important to ensure inclusivity, retention, and clinical outcomes.
Hi, and my name's Tom Bailey. I'm a retired naval officer. When I retired, I joined the faculty of the Navy's graduate school in Rhode Island. During that time, I started my deep dive into diversity, equity, and inclusion. I had the pleasure of being a dean and hiring the college's first Black female professor in its 120 plus year history. And when she was coming on board, she told me, please don't let them make me the diversity person. And 2 years later, I was the chief diversity officer, the first one for the college. Retired from that, and then started doing some part-time consulting work, where I've also been recently joined Indelible, helping them out. And then a month ago, I took a full-time position as the Associate Dean of Campus Operations at one of the Connecticut's 12 community colleges, and would like to put a disclaimer on this. The views expressed here are my own personal views and do not represent the state of Connecticut or the college.
Great. Thank you all so much. We're really excited for some of the questions that we have prepared, but for everybody listening, we are really open and excited to address your questions as well. Think of the barriers you see in your role, what you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and let's take advantage of the experience that this expert panel has. Any questions that you have, feel free to shoot them directly to me or to the host, and we will make sure to address them throughout our conversation today. So why don't we get started? The first question that I have for our expert panel is, where are you specifically engaging in the topic of DEI in your work environment today? And Yvonne, I'll get started with you if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thank you. So for Indelible, this is what we do every day, all day. We know that wellness is holistic overall, intending to cover 8 different dimensions: physical, emotional, spiritual, financial, social, occupational, intellectual, and environmental well-being. So we strongly advocate that when it comes to DEI and wellness, these should never be mutually exclusive conversations or efforts. This really includes bridging the topics of mental and physical health with DEI, because there's just plenty of data out there right now in terms of the far reaching implications of overall well being when people are discriminated against, othered, or excluded, right? Whether that's in presence, opportunity, or even when it comes to access. So, in order for organizations and communities to drive true health equity and allowing folks to really achieve the full potential in all aspects of health and well being, we have to intersect these topics.
Great. Omar, how about on your end?
Yeah, great question, Carol, and I liked Yvonne's answer to that. So where are we engaging in the topic of DEI in our work environments on a daily basis? Yeah, so at Dario, as we talk to employers, we see a range of concerns, including harm avoidance, risk reduction, ensuring health equity in chronic condition management. That's a huge issue. We see people who are very, very passionate about the topic. And are pushing for a real change across the industry. And as Yvonne mentioned, the concept of belonging, I think, is a really important theme that we hear as well. The need to belong is a very powerful, fundamental, and extremely persuasive kind of motivation that's key to improving retention and outcomes. Internally, I would say, at Dario, the objective is really to ensure that DEI are not, an appendage, not relegated to just some sort of committee that allows a box to be checked or some sort of department, but rather, how is this embedded into our operational workflows? How is it embedded into our leadership practices? This means that we end up spending a lot of time talking about, how do we ensure diversity of thought? How do we ensure diversity of experiences across our teams of decision makers? How do we think thoughtfully about how the process of soliciting input and putting ideas into action? How do we create a safe environment for those kinds of conversations? But it also means, because we're in the business of chronic condition management here at Dario, we're in the business of deploying health solutions to drive improvement in chronic conditions. And that means, and we use AI to do that, and machine learning and technology. And that means we have to attend to bias that's naturally embedded into algorithms, either from developers' side, but also because the input data themselves are flawed, because people receive care in the world, and care in the world itself contains these problems. So the data exhaust that's used to feed these processes also needs to be checked very, regularly for bias. So, I would say both internally and externally at Dario, DEI is part of, ongoing conversations happening across our total work experience, both internally, but also externally. As I mentioned, we hear it a lot from employers. But I would also add this, that anybody who says that they've resolved this matter or that they don't have this problem is not living in reality. This is a journey. It's a journey, but I don't mean that in a way that's dismissive. I mean to say that it's a journey, but it has clear, measurable milestones that can be measured and reported on, and we can hold ourselves accountable to. So I think it's a great question, Carol.
And Omar, just to echo that a little bit, the closer you get to the light, the more disparity you see. So I think as you are going through the journey, you see more and more gaps that you want to fill. And I think that's where we are in our journey, but Dario being such a member, user-centric organization, I think helps us shed light on a lot of those disparities. And we have the capacity to change them, which is why I think we are so excited about this topic specifically.
Surely true.
Tom, how about in your day-to-day work?
Well, my day-to-day work, I practice it as a leader. You know, it's part of my DNA. It's not a separate entity function, but it's something that I have to be thinking about and training, and kind of building on what Omar said is that I think we're in the midst of this transformation in this area of getting beyond the check in the box on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's such a triggering phrase, just like when the lawyer comes to speak to the company about ethics, you know, people click off. And we're seeing what's a result of people leaving companies, changing their jobs, pulling out of the workforce. And what is it? It's not because of the pay. It's because of that culture, that sense of belonging, that it's no longer their fit. And for too long, I think, you know, we focused on recruiting diversity, but we didn't do anything to retain it. And it really gets to that culture of working on inclusion and belonging. And so in a leadership position where I'm working right now, it's really trying to create that positive culture.
Yeah, and that segues really nicely with our next topic. If I can ask the panelists, what are some of the ways that employers can attend to DEI to most effectively engage employees in well-being? And let's start with you, Omar.
Sure. Yeah. So, you know, first of all, I think that, you know, in the midst of kind of this challenge with recruitment, with retention, with the cost of clinical care, with the cost of worsening chronic conditions, you know, employers, I think they have a great opportunity to leverage DEI as a powerful way of driving engagement. It's a tool. It's a tool that can be used to assist, to help people feel included, to ensure that they belong, and to drive engagement and participation, both in the workforce, but also in their own care and their health care. You know, who we are as individuals, as people, the core elements that define our health, that predict our health, they're often the missing pieces that we see when we look at the ecosystem of different chronic condition programs, whether that's analog or digital or telehealth. And you know, we've come, I think, a long way towards acknowledging health in a more holistic fashion. But I still think that when you look across the ecosystem, people tend to look at employees as blocks of like-minded people based on very rudimentary kinds of demographic data. And that won't work for engagement. It's the reason why you see a lot of disengagement in point solutions. You know, if you're going to do meaningful engagement, that's going to require that we move more deeply into people's individual needs. Or at Dario, we call those the personal determinants of health, or PDOH. So, you know, we've heard a lot about social determinants of health, very appropriately, you know, food insecurity and domestic, intimate partner violence, and all the challenges around social determinants of health, which are addressed at the population level. But the problem is that I can live in the same zip code or even the same city block as somebody else, and not be experiencing the same kinds of challenges that other person is experiencing. So this is why determinants of health need to drill down in a granular fashion to the personal level. And technology and AI offers an impressive way of addressing that. And so, you know, Dario began as a direct-to-consumer company, which means we had to do the hardest thing first, get anybody to use the solution and pay for it. And that essentially embeds consumer centricity into the DNA. So we've had to basically build solutions around solving what's important to people, what's so important that people are actually willing to pay for it themselves. And you know, that's helped us understand, I think, better at a deeper level, you know, how to create experiences that are relevant to each user. You know, relevancy is what drives engagement. Addressing those things that impact engagement on a deeper level. You know, one of the things we say at Dario is, you know, what matters to people is generally far more important than what's the matter with people. So if we don't understand, you know, what's really important to this individual, how do we maintain relevance in their life, then they're not going to keep the appointments. They're going to delete the applications on their phone. They're not going to engage. They're going to complain, actually, to their employers about these kinds of solutions. And it's going to drive a very significant mass disengagement. So personal determinants of health and addressing these things and attending to DEI, it's not just something that offers significant incremental value, but it also has the potential of, not focusing on it has the potential to very broadly disengage an audience, an important, critical stakeholder group. And ultimately, I think this is why you're going to see a lot of consolidation in the market around this, and a lot of, I think, failed companies that aren't addressing these kinds of topics.
Omar, I think everything you just said is right on point. The one area that I think is a nuance in terms of personal determinants of health is that they have the capacity to evolve and change. And the ability to be evolve and change with those personal determinants of health is key, because we are only as successful as we are in any given moment. Can you speak a little bit about that evolution and that ability to adapt?
Yeah, that's right. So if you look at the standard digital health playbook, and actually this gets to Kate's question that's in the chat as well, which I think is similar to yours around how do you create experiences to drive DEI. All right, so let's look at the standard digital health playbook, or the standard playbook. What folks will generally do, and this is taught in Digital Product Everywhere, is gather some data, even if it's rudimentary data, build personas based on those data, and then build some user journeys associated with that. And even if you apply AI to that process, it's very static. And what you end up with is maybe not one size fits all, but you end up with these assumptions that 5 sizes fit all, or 10 sizes fit all, which is astonishingly naive, because there is such huge diversity at baseline. But even more than that, even more importantly than that, and this gets to your question, Carole, is that people change over time. Just think about yourself. Think about something that you were willing to do last month or 2 months ago. Maybe you were willing to do those burpees last month, but you're not going to do it now. Maybe you needed a drill sergeant as a coach last month, but now you need some hand holding in a more gentle kind of tone. Maybe you were eating out more last month, but you need some recipes and grocery shopping tips today. Maybe you had, no chronic pain last month, or, no flare of your chronic pain last month, but you do right now. And all the ways we change over time. So to really, create these experiences that drive engagement around these areas means that solutions have to be not just personalized to me, because that's sort of, you could say, first generation digital health, which drives a lot of churn and disengagement. But for the evolution of digital health, those models need to be automated so that they dynamically, adaptively move with me as I change over time, and anticipate how I might change over time. And that kind of dynamic, automated approach is something that is sorely needed, and it's really core to the approach that Dario uses. A lot of I think the dirty little secret in AI is that AI is only good as the data that feeds it and the experts who annotate it, and those processes really need to be adjusted operationally to ensure that the journey that the person goes through is integrated across multiple chronic conditions, it's personalized to them, and it's dynamic and it's adaptive. That is currently missing from the market.
Absolutely.
Dovetail on a few things that Omar said. I think it's really important when we think about how we engage in the digital space, but then pivoting that to the experience in person, right? On the job and in communities. And when thinking specifically for employer groups, I think that leaders really need to focus on attuning their heads and hearts to some of the qualitative data, right? That they need to acquire and aggregate. What are the personal stories of employees to really understand the implications of their surroundings, the culture, and how that directly correlates and impacts their lives overall? I think a lot of employers look at DEI through the lens of human resources, right? And they're very quick to talk about it in the sphere of attraction, engagement, retention of employees, right? As resources, if you will. But there's the human case for DEI as much as there is the business case for it all. And I think that organizations need to understand those larger impacts, looking at the ripple effects to individuals and diverse populations within the orgs to earnestly engage them. So I think to Kate's question, we need to be talking to folks. We need to listen to folks. We need to believe them and their lived experiences. And then pivoting that to get about documenting, challenging, and really changing the internal systems that create the disparities in the first place.
And to build on that, I can say, coming from the military, as I joined, it was coming off the draft where the approach was one size fits all. And I recently read the book Reset by Johnny Taylor, who's the CEO of SHRM. And he talks about this big reset that's going on. I mean, we've been in each other's living rooms through Zoom, whatever. The relationship between employer and employee has shifted. It is transformed, and we no longer view employees as a commodity. They are resources, they are individuals, they're human beings. And so that requires a different way of thinking, a different approach to do that and recognize the differences. And it requires being courageously curious, getting to know who your people are and what their needs are to the individual level.
I agree. It's almost like a health impact assessment that needs to be done inside the culture to really help those who are facing the inequities and contributing, everybody contributing, right? Not just leaders or folks in HR or the heads of ERGs, but everyone contributing to solving some of these challenges and creating the reforms necessary in the systems and decision making to really close the disparity gaps.
So Yvonne, Kate specifically just asked, since we don't have enough leaders with a diverse background, and I think a lot of folks deal with that, would focus groups of diverse people and start asking them questions regarding culture and healthcare access. Is that one tactic to accomplish that? What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think that should be fundamental. So, as employers are engaging in pulse surveys of their workforce, those are really important data points to get to chart in terms of measuring progress, figuring out where some additional gaps and opportunities might lie and addressing those. But we can't discount the qualitative data aspects, and having those focus groups and those conversations are really important to really understand what the challenges are of individuals. Pivoting back to that point that Carole, both you and Omar both made, right? Is that taking that perspective about not just broad sweeping and collecting, these are our viewpoints on Black, Indigenous, people of color, or those who might identify in some other dimension of diversity when it comes to gender, sexual orientation, abilities, disabilities, etc. But really focusing on hearing the individual and voices, collecting that information, and then synthesizing that to come out with some really great strategies and objectives in which to address the challenges.
And I would say that regardless of where you are in the journey, there is always incremental change to be made, whether you are at the beginning of the spectrum or the end of the spectrum. And, I will tell you one thing that we did here, and this wasn't for business purposes, this was just internally for our Darios, a day in the life of a Dario, because we have people all over the world with very varying social and personal determinants of life and of health and of whatever. And just seeing someone's life and how it differs from yours has brought us together. And I think sharing it has brought a component and a facet of inclusion that I've never experienced before. So even little things like this can help push you on the spectrum in an incremental perspective.
Absolutely. I fully agree. I mean, we need to be having conversations, and from conversations, oftentimes comes not only knowledge, but the understanding that oftentimes we are not as different as we believe that we are. Our experiences based on a number of factors might be different, but you will find often when you pull groups together, right? Maybe a women's group, ERG, that as you start doing roundtable and discussing, you're figuring out that the mother that comes from Africa may have some of the same challenges as a mother who comes from Westport, Connecticut, or some other country or part of the United States of America. And it is that shared experience that I think is incredibly powerful, incredibly informative, and helps to cultivate the B that we are all focusing on these days, which is belonging.
Yeah, absolutely. Omar, from your perspective, what do you see to be some of the biggest gaps and barriers for us to achieving this ideal state?
All right, so I mean, I think that's a great question. It's a huge question, and I think we can only survey it here at the highest levels. But I think that, you know, of course, we see challenges in health equity, as we mentioned. That's enormous. I mean, that means you get different care and different outcomes based on factors that are beyond your control, and that's terrible. I mean, we don't want that. We have a moral obligation to solve that. So, I mean, you see access to healthy foods, you see, as I mentioned, food deserts, language barriers, cultural barriers to care, educational barriers, many others like Yvonne has mentioned. I think, but central to it is the playbook. I mean, the approach we're using is fundamentally flawed. And that approach is viewing people as these sort of large static blocks. And even if we say we don't do that, our operational processes show that we do that, in fact. And so the proof is in the pudding, right? So we've heard, as I mentioned, we've heard so much about social determinants of health. That's very important, but it just can't get us all the way there to the kind of personalization, Carole, that you were talking about. And the biggest challenge is the lack of this kind of dynamic, adaptive personalization, you know, at a very practical level. I mean, just to ground it down, you know, to very, very personal kind of level, you know, we're asking people to engage in programs that weren't built for them, that don't reflect their preferences and that don't reflect their priorities. And then we wonder why that's happening. And so, you know, and also let me say this, most people who have a chronic condition have multiple conditions. So then you think to yourself, okay, well, I'm gonna focus on partners and solutions that have some focus on DI. Maybe they have some data in this area, but you know, they're not integrated with the other point solutions. And you have also a vendor management nightmare with, you know, multiple solutions going after that, and not a good user experience for people that have to do many different, you know, experiences to manage their care. Often those are conflicting with each other. And so I think chronic condition programs in general, digital health, needs to do a better job of incorporating the principles we've been talking about of DEI, addressing all the different personal dimensions from DEI, from maybe culturally relevant content in the digital programs to the right kind of training for the human beings that are supporting these folks through their journeys in different ways. You know, every touch point basically offers an opportunity to think about, you know, how can we dynamically personalize engagement in ways that are meaningful to each person. I do think that the programs that are able to deliver that kind of experience that feels relevant to each person, it feels relevant to me, to you, those are the ones that are going to be able to address the challenges we see today. Those are the ones that present an integrated, multi-condition, you know, dynamic, hyper-personalized kinds of use journeys. And we're just not going to see that out of the myriad proliferating, you know, venture-backed point solutions that are out there that are really saturating the market, but not meeting the mark.
So let's drill down on that a little bit more with a question we just received from one of our attendees. So how do we bridge the gap between privacy and getting to those personal determinants? So the question is, one of the barriers is privacy and an employee or a member's not wanting to share personal information that could perhaps help us curate a more relevant and meaningful experience for them. How do we bridge that gap so that we can get that information while still helping them feel a level of privacy. So, Omar, let me start with you, and then we can go around.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So first of all, privacy is tightly linked to trust. And there is, for very good reason, deep distrust with these kinds of solutions, especially from minority communities and communities of color. And we actually don't have to go back very far in our national or history to see those examples of people whose trust has been violated. And I was listening to the CEO of one of the very, very large kind of, collect your DNA and tell you about you companies. And, they face these same challenges too, which is, why would I do that? I have no reason to trust you. And so, I think one of the ways is to be just absolutely transparent with people. This is, and I'm not talking about in some 45-page term and condition, but to have a conversation with people, look, this is what we collect. This is why we collect it. It's to help you. If you feel like you don't want to share that with us, that's okay too. Let's build trust first. But I do think that trust comes when you generate wins in the life of people that are relevant to them. So if I come to you with a solution for problem A, and you tell me that your real problem is problem B, even if you also have A, and then I focus on A, I'm going to lose you. But if I focus on B with you, kind of walk with you in this journey in a relevant way, produce a win for you in B, then you're going to trust me on A and other areas. You're going to share that information with me. So I guess I would say it's transparency, it's authenticity, and it's delivering value in what matters to people. I think that's how you get there. But I think it's a great question, and everybody's facing this challenge right now.
Yep. Tom, anything, or Yvonne? Yep. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Omar really hit it on the nail on the head here. It gets down to trust. And if you're encountering those type of obstacles, that's telling you something unto itself about the culture in that area, that if you can't get people to open that up, and it gets back to looking at your organization, does it have a fixed mindset? Or is it a culture of growth, a growth mindset, being able to grow and learn? And I think you got to make sure that the foundation, the field is planted right and fertilized and prepared before you plant these seeds. And recognize, somebody made the comment earlier about long range versus short range. It's good to have that long range vision, but you're never going to get there. This is, as Omar said earlier, you're always going to be going down this path, and you are going to trip up occasionally. You're going to slide back a little bit. But the real question you got to ask yourself is, am I within the guidelines? Am I headed in the right direction? And am I staying within the framework that I want to do to make sure that we can be the best we can? Yvonne, you were going to say something?
Just to support this premise of trust, I think one way that you can build that trust is through inclusion, right? And I think that people want to, not only do they need to be seen and need to be heard, they need to have opportunities on a continuum to be included in these critical conversations. And I think doing that over time, being very intentional and authentic about that, is a way to build that trust. And using your analogy, Tom, regarding the gardening, I think even a step before that is the proper tilling of the ground. And that proper tilling of the ground is doing that work, is having those inclusive conversations with folks so that they can feel like, wow, they really want to know and understand me. And then over time, I'm more apt to divulge more about myself personally, more about my conditions and what's needed, what's not meeting my needs, and what my challenges are, from a myriad of perspectives, right? Whether that's in the workplace, whether or not the well-being programs that are being offered don't address what I really need them to address. And then what are the other implications of existing systems, policies, et cetera, that are potentially negatively impacting my experience as an employee, for an example, and then that continues into further implications, right? So when we think about not being seen and what that barrier does, well, if someone's not seen, we can look at it the facet of maybe somebody who's worked a long time for a company, but there are forms of discrimination there. This person's not seen, this person's not being promoted. People are very quick to look at that through the singular lens of, oh, well, that has an impact on the wealth gap or their socioeconomic conditions, but they're not seeing the additional downstream impacts of when that person does not have the financial means. They may not have the right access to healthcare. They may have to prioritize other things above healthy meals or moving their family into a safer neighborhood. They might not, be able to do the things that kind of move along their health and well-being overall. And so I think that we need to take a much deeper dive and widen the lens on how we're seeing DEI intersect with some of these things, and understand that the impacts are so much more broader than some of the surface level conversations that I sometimes hear with various employer groups.
Hey,
And
Yvonne, I'm sorry, but that leads to a question. As we look at downstream impacts, and Tom, you mentioned, I think, sort of being able to adapt your strategy. So I'll sound like the devil's advocate here, but as you look at organizations, whether they're not for profit, for profit, they have finite budgets, right? So we always come back as we're consulting with them in terms of how do they measure success. And let me say, I ask this with the perspective that as it relates to well-being, what's different today, I think in a very positive way, is the availability of top shelf analytics and expertise. Our analytics, whether it's ours or someone else's for that matter, should be able to tell you what happened, why is it happening? What if these trends continue? What should I do? And that allows organizations, as they set their budget and their strategy and their communication to employees, to tack quickly and change direction and be agile. So how would you recommend companies, organizations measure their success? And let's see. Omar, your thoughts.
Yeah, no, this is critically important because, as I mentioned at the beginning when we were opening it up, that it's a journey. Carole, others confirmed it's a journey, but it has milestones, and those need to be measured. And it's not some loosey-goosey thing. Actually, someone in the chat said, how are you going to do this if it has a 10-year time horizon? How are you actually going to, hold accountability? And the way to do that is to be very, very clear about what the success metrics are, and to recognize that you're never done. We're never done. We make progress in this area, and so. I would say, look, the primary, and I've gotten into trouble for saying this before, but I really believe this is true. The primary metric, the secondary metric, the tertiary metric, engagement and retention, period. That's it. Will people use it? Because whether you've done some study at Stanford, wherever else, and you've got some published trial on some highly, sanitized population that you managed to get better to use your digital solution or whatever else, it's irrelevant if in the wild people aren't actually using it. So it has to be engagement and retention, has to be the first scorecard. If you don't have that, go back to the drawing board, get some more funding or whatever it is you need to do. So do people actually use it? All right. And then next is, well, which people are using it? Right. And so that's a very powerful question, because when you talk about digital health solutions, yes, we have widespread smartphone adoption in the US. And interestingly enough, it's pretty consistent across ethnic groups in terms of their use of smartphone, but there are significant disparities in broadband access. So have you designed your user journeys so that they can be asynchronous? Many of our users at Dario, you get the internet at the Wendy's and the Walmart. And have you built your journeys to support that kind of thing? So at Dario, we look very careful. Oh, by the way, and not only who's using it, who isn't using it, who is not using it, and really making sure that you address that. How diverse are the users of the platform? Which groups are underrepresented? At Dario, we look at that very closely. So for example, just off the top of my head, nearly a third of our users are over the age of 65, 30%. A quarter of our users come from the lowest socioeconomic status zip code. So that would be like, you don't expect that with digital health, to have that sort of thing. We've looked at and measured and published our results in Spanish-speaking outcomes for our Spanish-speaking members. Do they get the same results, or did someone just use, Google Translate and assume that it was going to work for these other populations, which of course it won't work that way, and so that's the kind of thing you got to keep, analyzing and looking at those questions. And you can't just do that on an ad hoc basis. So there's a lot of people who say, okay, well, I'm going to focus on this. And then they go and look at some subpopulation. That's a good thing. But really have to establish evaluating these disparities into the operational workflows of your organization. So like when we acquire a company at Dario, when we bring an integrated condition onto our integrated platform, we hold accountability through KPIs, making sure that we are hitting these kinds of targets. But it's not just the stick, it's the carrot. We reward, and it's important to reward achieving these kinds of measured milestones. So if you hit it, that's a good thing, and we're going to recognize that. You're going to be recognized for that. That's important. So I think you should ask, how do we measure success was your question. I think you should ask, if you're an employer out there, you should ask vendors, partners, anybody that you're trusting to care for your members, how diverse are your users today? Tell me today about the distribution of the users on your platform today. All right, that's number one. What outcomes do you see in those subpopulations, like I mentioned with our Spanish-speaking outcomes or our older adult outcomes, those sorts of things? Have you published those outcomes? Those are the kinds of questions that people should be asking it. By that yardstick, I think at Dario, we're clearly on the right path. But nearly everybody in the industry that I look at, I'd be curious to get everybody else's perspective, but nearly everybody in the industry is very primitive in terms of how they're approaching success metrics in DEI. And if I may be rather blunt about it, I think we all need a swift kick in the bottom to get moving here on this, because we're behind the 8 ball as an ecosystem, as an industry, even though we're proud of what we're doing at Dario to make advances there. Yeah.
But let me just pull that out with a deeper question to the panel on this. So if we're sitting down with management and a group that represents employees today, and we were going to say, we want to look at as much data as we can, and then a year from now, this is what they're going to ask us, Lockton or Dario or Indelible. They want to say, what should we look at a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 3 years from now, even if it's a range that tells us our efforts have been successful. And how you define success is going to vary, but with the right data, I think we can. Do you think we can do that?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. I think something that Omar hit on is really critical, and that's getting those baseline KPIs. And then you want to use those same measurements over time. And I dare say most employers, I encourage them to actually be getting that data, sourcing that data on a quarterly basis to see how you may need to move the needle. They need to be much more agile as it relates to that. They need to embed this as part of their standard operating procedures, if you will, so that they're constantly able to get that information and respond to it more so in a real time than waiting until the end of a year to say, okay, this is where we started, now where did we end up? If you do it more frequently, if you're looking at those same metrics and you're out getting the pulse checks on your workforce, you are in a much better position to be able to pivot on strategies, get quicker adoption of new technologies, new interventions, et cetera. And I dare say that is where you're going to see the success.
Yeah, I agree. And, I think we've focused too long on measuring levels of effort. In this field of, we did unconscious bias training for 98% of the employees. What did that do to the outcome? Focusing on the output. And like I said, a lot of this gets back to the relationship. between each other, between the company and its employees. And I often refer to this as a marriage. And Omar, I love your answer, engaged and retention. I mean, if you're still married and still having a productive engagement with your spouse, it's good, and there's those indicators that tell you something's not quite right, and so you've really got to ask yourself, what do I really want to be watching? What are those indicators so that I can be proactive and intentional in this to do it and keep working at it and keeping the train on the tracks, headed in the right direction.
And the thing that I like about this, I'll just add, is when you roll out a strategy, I like what you said, not just effort, but our clients want to know that, okay, we should be looking for employee engagement to go from X to X, health outcomes to go from X to X, surveys in terms of people feeling as though they belong and they're included to go from X to X, because everything begins and ends with data. That's how we set our strategy. And that's how we need to adjust milestones. Hey, you could be 1 quarter into your DEI well-being strategy and you realize, okay, it's not working, or it's not working as good as it can. Let's tack left or let's tack right.
And I think, Ted, to build on that, it's also looking at what populations have been perhaps unengageable in the past and why, and being able to solve for that and serve up personalized solutions to make it easier for them to engage will completely be driven, that knowledge will be driven by the data. And having that information and being able to move the needle on those demographics will be really crucial. Building on Tom's analogy, just like any marriage, any relationship, no one marriage is like another. So there really has to be this, one-to-one personalized approach. And, the questions that I'm being asked that I'd like your feedback on is how do we scale that? And Yvonne, maybe I'll start with you, but how do we scale a one-to-one personalized approach?
Well, you hit the nail on the head a moment ago, Carole, and that's data, right? And when we get those data points that give us our compass, if you will, on where we should be heading, then we need to take that information, strategize with it, and then add voices to that, right? So when you're looking at particular populations, if you're seeing lack of adoption, right, in particular areas, then it's really important to get those voices at the table to say, hey, this is the challenge. How do we solve for this? And make people an inclusive part of the solutioning. And I think that's how you can help to scale it. I think another aspect of that is making sure that those relationships, right, that we talked about are there and they are strong. Because you're going to need them to leverage to advance advocacy. And that's another huge component of scaling is who are your advocates for this, your boots on the ground that are going out and saying, hey, this has really worked for me, or, you should take part in this study or this initiative or be a part of this group or that group so that your voice can be heard so that we can start to really impact these things. And that's how a big component, I would say, of how you scale these efforts. It keeps
Great.
going back to that relationship aspect.
And the trust, absolutely.
Yeah.
Just logistics quickly, we have about 5 minutes left for our attendees. I've pulled up our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us as you have additional questions, depending on who they pertain to. We're more than happy to help. Thank you so much for attending today and remaining retained and engaged with us, since that seems to be the theme. But in the last few minutes, any closing remarks from our expert panelists? Tom, maybe I'll start with you and we'll just go around to close it out.
The challenge that I see often in this is people want to see what's my return on investment or something like that, or they focus in on this metrics. And I think you really got to understand this requires a degree of intentionality and some courageousness that you're going to make some errors. And so when you're trying to assess how you're going, I would not ask necessarily looking for those indicators of success, but look for those indicators where you could grow, where you can do better, where you can put some effort into it. And then the other challenge that you're going to have in this area is finding that direct linkage of this action with this result, because what makes a marriage successful? I don't know. But there's a lot of things that go into making a marriage successful, and trying to find out there is no silver bullet, just like there's no shot that you can get for this, like a vaccination, unfortunately, to make this all better. And so it requires a lot of intentionality and some careful thought, and really working hard at it.
Yvonne?
I would say don't forget to celebrate the small wins. There's something very powerful and gives us all momentum, right? As we are on this journey, as we are trying to progress. So don't forget to celebrate those as you have your eye on the bigger goals. Definitely celebrate those and use those to energize the change makers within your organizations.
Great. And Omar?
Yeah, I guess I would say I think there's a reason to view DEI as very similar to the other things we point our attention and focus to, not something separate, but very consistent with what employers are trying to achieve. Employees are trying to generate demonstrated ROI. They're trying to simplify the healthcare ecosystem. They're trying to consolidate solutions to make them broadly applicable and less confusing. They're trying to focus on rising cost areas, many of which affect communities disproportionately. And they're trying to delight employees and be consumer-centric and focus on things like engagement and retention. And to the extent to which companies that employ approaches like the ones we've talked about today do that, then we generate wins for employers and employees. So I think there's a tendency to view this as, trust us, it'll eventually pay off. And that may be true. But at the same time, there's immediate wins that can be gained, immediate ROI-focused kinds of wins that can be achieved right now by the right partnerships in this area that affect precisely the things that our employer, purchasing considerations today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. That brings us to the end. Thank you to our expert panel. I know that we can talk for several more hours, but we won't take up any more of people's times. Ted, it's been a pleasure, as always, to co-host with you, and we will be hopefully talking to everyone soon. Everyone have a great rest of the week.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
All right, thanks.